Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. As a reviewer, it's been challenging to talk about Bob Dylan albums for various reasons. Sometimes, as in an album like Highway 51 Revisited, there's just so many lyrics, it doesn't really feel right to talk about these albums in a concise enough way, but you don't want your review to get too long. So I was going through Bob Dylan's discography, and I was very excited to get to this album, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, just because throughout the years, ever since I've been a music nerd, I've just always gone on allmusic.com and gone through the career albums of a musician. And so I just assumed that this album about outlaws was going to be a good Bob Dylan album. What I'm going to do with this video instead, rather than talk about the Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid album, is talk about the two things Bob Dylan put out and collectively talk about his weird 1973. So it seems like Bob Dylan went on a kind of weird hiatus in the early 1970s. The decade saw with him releasing two albums. There's New Morning, which was a good one, but it seemed to be about wanting to get away from making music. And then there was Self-Portrait, which was very controversial. Grail Marcus started his review with, "What is this shit?" It was an album of mostly covers, and we can speculate it was either Dylan just getting so used to the idea that people liked everything he put out, he didn't realize people would be under-enthused for his overly long covers collection, or it was him intentionally trolling his audience trying to escape from fame. Well, anyway, despite the fact that Bob Dylan was so prolific in the 1960s, after the release of New Morning in 1970, we don't get a new album in 1971 or 1972. Now, you could say he makes up for that because he gave us two records in 1973, but they didn't exactly feel like real records. So what is this Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid thing? It was a soundtrack for a movie. I briefly considered when I got this album watching the movie, as I've done before, but the movie seems to have gotten mostly negative reviews. And while on some occasions I'm open to the idea that movies might actually be interesting despite getting rad reviews, sometimes things get punished for being weird or eccentric, but I've started to grow pretty cynical about movies starring musicians. And the reason is that these movies, they reliably seem to be held back in a way, as if the directors are afraid of letting the musicians act. That was my real criticism of the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club movie, where the Bee Gees and Peter Frampton weren't given any dialogue, even though I think at least Robin Gibb would be a very charismatic performer. Like, this idea of saying, well, they're musicians, they can't do real acting, doesn't make sense to me, because A, you're making a movie, so either let them act or don't, but also acting doesn't have to be Marlon Brando good to be entertaining. Musicians are people with stage presence, with charisma. They can do something to entertain you, even if they're not realistic actors. Anyway, this movie has Chris Christopherson in it. It has Bob Dylan in it. I didn't bother seeing it. Is it better than its reputation? No idea. But the album itself is definitely disappointing. I kind of figured when I got to this one that Bob Dylan liked Westerns. That was obvious in his earlier album, John Wesley Harding, which was a great album. And Nashville Skyline, another country-inspired album, wasn't bad either. I was also really excited for this one because this is the album associated with the classic Knocking on Heaven's Door. But, as I've really come to learn by this point in the project, just because an album has one good song on it, you can't assume the other material on it. It can go wrong for various reasons, either because the rest of the album is just knockoffs of the one-hit song, or because there's nothing else there beside the one-hit song. And in the case of this album, it's the latter. You see, most of this album is just instrumentals. And that might be one thing if Bob Dylan was an elite instrumental musician, but he's Bob Dylan. He's not Glenn Gould. People listen to him for his lyrics. So the instrumentals just tend to be folk blues jams that I can't really say are even composition. At a certain point you wonder, is this a Bob Dylan album, or are the members of his band composing this just as much as he is? But I also think this record speaks to an interesting dilemma that comes whenever one is asked to write songs for something or for someone else. Occasionally I've thought about the idea of writing songs for my friends, and then I kind of get stuck because presumably if you write a song for a person and they commissioned you or they're into the idea, what they want is the chance to sing a song in your style. Whereas you and the writer think you have this new challenge to write in a different style appropriate for that person. So I imagine if a movie's trying to sell itself on the fact that we have a Bob Dylan written soundtrack, they want it to be the most epic soundtrack ever. They want their soundtrack to be as cool as Blonde on Blonde or Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. But rather than giving the movie that pizzazz, Bob Dylan, it seemed, challenged himself just to be a normal, mundane movie scoring musician. And as such, he just wrote a bunch of instrumentals that kind of blend into the background. Even the most epic song that hit on this album, Knocking on Heaven's Door, the compared to other Bob Dylan songs, it has very minimal lyrics, so they don't risk getting in the way of the storytelling. I get it. If you're making a movie, you can't have very loud singing. You can't have it getting in the way of the story, but leave that challenge to the editors and the sound mixers. You give the best songs possible and let them find a way to strip it down if it's absolutely necessary. This album only has one other song on it with lyrics, though there are 3 different takes of the song with Bob Dylan experimenting with different singing voices. I guess that's kind of what makes this an interesting historical document. If you've been listening to the Dylan albums all along, he varies his voice up quite a bit from the sort of soft folk of the early albums to the sort of cynical half-talk singing of the mid-60s to the country crooner of Nashville Skyline. So you get different versions of his voice on all these different versions of the song Billy. And the song Billy basically just narrates the action of the film. It tries to be a bit more of an interesting song by ending each line with a sort of metaphorical summation of Billy, the kid's state in the world, like, Billy, they don't like you to be so free. But it still feels like this song is just serving the purpose of the movie, and Bob Dylan isn't really creating in a free way. The other Bob Dylan album from 1973 is really hard to find, and unfortunately, I couldn't find myself a physical copy. I was kind of conflicted about whether I even bothered talking about this one because it's not really a Bob Dylan album. Bob Dylan didn't put it together. It was just various outtakes of work he'd done in the studio previously. But you see, 1973's Dylan was just something that Columbia Records put out when they realized they weren't going to get any more music from Bob Dylan. He had signed a contract elsewhere. And it was basically just Self-Portrait Part 2. These were not Bob Dylan original songs. These were covers of folk songs and popular music. Now, in defense of 1973's Dylan, which more so than Self-Portrait seems to have the reputation as his worst album, this one is actually concise. I didn't mind Self-Portrait until I realized it was 20-something songs long, and one okay cover after another eventually adds up to a snooze fest. Dylan is only 9 songs long, so if nothing else, you don't feel bored by the end of it. It opens with a nice brisk track called Lily of the West, which has a nice upbeat strumming pattern to it that's reminiscent of the covers work on Bob Dylan's very first album, which was an album I quite enjoyed. Then I think the highlight of this album is his version of I Can't Help Falling in Love with You, the song Elvis famously got a hit of from his movie Blue Hawaii. And I think what works so well about this cover is that, Bob Dylan and Elvis's voices are so different that rather than just this feeling like a cheap knockoff, it really feels like a sort of character explanation of Bob Dylan, the singer. On Self-Portrait, he covered songs by Paul Simon and Gordon Lightfoot, where it just sounds like one folkie copying another folkie's craft when that other folkie is better adapted. By contrast with this song, it's a sort of song of humbling oneself to love, and perhaps Bob Dylan's voice is even better for it than Elvis's. Elvis has this sort of rich, cocky baritone voice that I feel like in some of the songs he did in the early 60s just sounds kind of campy because it makes the lyrical delivery sound non-genuine. Whereas Bob Dylan singing in his raspy voice saying, take my hand, take my whole life too, it sounds genuinely beautiful. And when he throws in a harmonica solo onto this one, it's just perfect. Then we get another nice 70s sounding recording of a folk song called Sarah Jane with a nice joyful backup vocal. It reminds me of some of the performances I heard on the Johnny Cash show, particularly Eric Anderson singing his song Born Again. The problem is after those first 13 track, everything else stops feeling special. We get covers of Joni Mitchell's Big Yellow Taxi and Jerry Jeff Walker's Mr. Bojangles, whereas the listener, you just go, I've heard a better version of this somewhere else. There's one other Elvis cover on there. Elvis previously recorded a song called Now and Then There's a Fool Such as I. But unlike the heartfelt I Can't Help Falling in Love with You, this one just sounds like a campy style imitation. It's not a special performance. I guess one other song on here that's kind of okay is called Marianne. And while it's not the Leonard Cohen songs, So Long Marianne, it has kind of a Leonard Cohen vibe to it because you have the very rough vocal performance from Dylan complemented by very beautiful backup singing. This is a style I guess Leonard Cohen would sort of pursue more in the 1980s, but it's kind of funny. Dylan and Cohen are compared, and here is still a fairly young Dylan anticipating the style of an older Leonard Cohen. But yeah, overall, I feel like the problem with these Dylan covers albums is that Bob Dylan covers can be enjoyable to listen to, but they're best when he goes for folk songs as opposed to interpreting the work of his peers. And one could come up with various psychological reasons for it. It could just be that, to me, the folk songs aren't familiar, so they sound just like Bob Dylan singing an original. And maybe if I did listen to a lot of old Folkways records, I'd also be underwhelmed by those covers. It's hard to know. I guess the thing with covers is for them to be special, you have to bring something else to the table. Elvis sings covers with one of the best voice on earth. That makes a difference. When Jimi Hendrix covers a song and adds the best guitar solos on earth, that makes a difference. And sometimes Bob Dylan's voice brings something special to the table. It's just not enough to make 1973's Dylan a great album. So let me know if you have any thoughts on the two albums Bob Dylan put out in 1973, but I'm more excited for talking about his next album, Planet Waves. I've never listened to it any before, but it just has one of my favorite titles. It sounds so relaxing, and it of course has the song Forever Young and features the band on it. So I'm excited for that. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.